Welcome to Town Talk, Town Manager Update. Again, 2 in 1 week. Town Manager Ells, you are here to talk about DEP and regulations for septic systems, watersheds. Public comment closes on January 30th. But let's start with the base piece of this and why these regulations are going in, how the town has put a comprehensive wastewater plan already in place, a management plan already in place, and how that relates to the DEP regulations that are now before us for comment.
Okay, all right, so I'll try to go through this in an organized, logical way. So, saltwater bodies are impacted by nitrogen loading, especially when they're bays and they flush in and out, in and out, in and out. That nitrogen loading, depending on how much, can impact them and impact them negatively. We've been studying this on Cape Cod for the better part of 20 years now.
Sure.
And we know that we have, 85% or so of our properties are what we refer to as Title V systems. We have tanks and leaching pits in the ground in our backyard. Now, where does nitrogen come from? It comes from our urine. So, and it pretty much goes in and then leaves those systems and then goes into the groundwater. And then when it hits the saltwater bodies, it is like fertilizer. So it causes detrimental impact over years and decades, which has resulted in significant impairment of our embayments to the point where we've gone through a process over the last decade of modeling and establishing total maximum daily limits of nitrogen into our bays because they're all exceeding what's allowable. Now, under the Clean Water Act, once that TMDL is set, we have to have a plan in place to address it if it exceeds. So that's what we call the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan, that we do have one and it's been approved. What's going on with the Title V regulatory changes is, concurrent with this, I think there's a recognition by the state of Massachusetts regulators that we collectively haven't necessarily moved forward quickly enough on removing nitrogen. And technology advances and innovative on-site systems are a great way to reduce nitrogen. Yet there really isn't a clear mechanism within Title V to allow a regular homeowner to know how to even do that. So we've got two discussions going on, and we're kind of talking past each other out there. One is communities like Barnstable have an approved CWMP that you hear a lot. You see the sewers going in. That's a big part, not only part, but a big part of how we're going to meet our TMDLs. And the state has said, yes, you've proven to us that if you do everything in your CWMP, in the sewer expansion program, as well as everything else you've identified, we believe you're going to satisfy that requirement and therefore not be in violation of the Clean Water Act. Then we have a whole discussion going on about reducing nitrogen. Now, it isn't necessarily linked back to this TMDL regulatory requirement. It is that general recognition that nitrogen causes problems in our saltwater embayments. We've been waiting decades to do something, and quite honestly, not a lot has happened on Cape Cod relevant to this issue. It is now. So this is kind of really confusing because we're out there saying we got to expand the sewer, and now DEP is coming out with this effort. But this is an effort to change the regs to require for communities and really down to individual households will have on-site Title V systems to upgrade those to reduce the amount of nitrogen. Now, the really important piece here for our public to understand is that doesn't necessarily mean it's enough so that you won't have to sewer someday.
Right.
It just means that they're asking you to put in a system that will reduce nitrogen. Now, the regulation speaks about, okay, towns who have approved comprehensive wastewater management plans, those can, with a DEP approval, can be turned into nitrogen management plans. So, if the state approves that, then you could continue to follow your CWMP, your sewer expansion plan, and therefore your community won't have to go out and put all of these innovative on-sites in. Because over a period of time, now the new proposed regulations talk about reduction of 75% of nitrogen within 20 years. Our plan is a 30-year plan to reduce the nitrogen down enough so that we meet our TMDLs. Okay, so we really have to talk about how are those two interchangeable? Will they be approved by the DEP? They're saying that an approved CWMP, if implemented, can be the nitrogen management plan, and therefore a community that has that, that's been approved as a nitrogen management plan, won't have to go out and do all of these innovative on-sites.
Okay.
To be determined.
Right.
We don't know whether the regulation will be adopted that way. We assume it will be because they've written up a draft that way. And then how they will implement that regulation over time. So a lot of my residents are saying, well, you have a CWMP, as long as we keep going with the sewer plan, why would we have to do all of this other stuff? Good question, to be determined, because these are state regulations. We don't do that interpretation, the state regulators do. We got to see what gets adopted and then how it gets implemented. On the wastewater side, we're going to be having discussions this week with our council about the need for additional revenues to offset the cost of continuing to expand the sewer system. So tune into that as well, because if there's a decision that we don't establish those revenue sources, that will impact the validity of the CWMP. And my concern is I don't want to see it render us not having a nitrogen management plan that the state will accept. So there's a lot of moving pieces here for our residents to follow.
Right. You've talked a lot about the alternative septic system, and I think a lot of us understand that Title V piece. I've gone through septic system replacement and understand that process. But there's also the watershed permit that the town possibly can pursue. And is that tied into the nitrogen management plan?
It is, and it's tied in, right now, under the regulations, DEP or our Board of Health could designate this watershed area as nitrogen sensitive, but we really don't see that happening.
Okay.
I don't know that many communities have even done it, maybe one.
Right.
These are Massachusetts regulations, just
Sure.
so this isn't just the towns on Cape Cod. So, but coastal communities are really the most impacted by this nitrogen issue for the reasons I've already said. So what this is saying is they're going to designate these areas as nitrogen sensitive areas, and in essence we've already done it under the modeling. Like, we know that all of the south side is nitrogen sensitive.
Correct, yep.
We also know that Barnstable Harbor is not. So how will that interplay? There's some other aspects, though, non-related to this issue, but related to Title V, if you have an on-site private well with an on-site system. So where, it isn't just this one issue of nitrogen to the embayment that we need to look at. We need to look at all the issues. And that's why it's DPW, Board of Health, and my respective staff going to make our comments by January 30th. But basically, the areas, land and bay, that are where the water comes from precipitation, goes into the ground, through the ground, to the bay, that is a coastal recharge area. Those become the nitrogen sensitive areas. Now, we also have to think about how we interact with other communities, because, for example, we have 4 coastal embayments along the south side in Barnstable. We have Pompanesett Shoestring that we share with Mashpee and Sandwich. We have 3 bays that we share with Mashpee and Sandwich. We have East Bay Centerville River that is just Barnstable. And then we have Lewis Bay, which is Yarmouth and Barnstable. When you do designate a nitrogen-sensitive area, it doesn't look at those political boundaries. It looks at the environmental boundaries.
Okay.
So we got multiple towns in 3 of our 4, and looking at how those regulations will address the requirements of a nitrogen management plan are still unclear, because what happens if 2 communities have approved CWMPs and they're implementing them, and one hasn't done theirs yet? That's absolutely the case on the west side of us,
Right.
or on the east side of us. So does that mean that we won't get, because this isn't the boundaries of Barnstable?
Right. They don't know where the nitrogen
Uh,
is coming into the bay.
No, they do.
Well,
They do,
right.
but it is, unless you collectively proceed with addressing this, and it's about getting to the TMDL for the CWMP, then how can they approve that as your nitrogen management plan? We're assuming, based on what has been said to us, that each of those communities that I've described for their respective load will be held accountable for theirs, but not the others. But again, the other communities. But on the other hand, if they're trying to reduce nitrogen, then that would make sense. If they're trying to get to a TMDL, that wouldn't make sense, because you won't get to your TMDL unless everybody is doing their part. So there's a lot to be interpreted here. Our concern is multiple on this, but I think bottom line, we want our residents to know that what lies ahead for them. And I think under the more confusing scenario, they adopt these regs. In the interim, people have to put in innovative on-sites to reduce nitrogen, and then ultimately have to sewer.
Right.
We're also looking at the fact that we know regulations regarding emerging contaminants are coming, and these systems don't address that. And that we're looking at phosphorus as well now. All you got to do is read about cyanobacteria and about our freshwater bodies. And for years we thought, oh yeah, we've taken care of phosphorus. Well, we're in a very different point of understanding now relevant to that. So we can't just talk about nitrogen removal and innovative on-sites. We've got to be able to talk about emerging contaminant and phosphorus removal as well, or else that'll push us to sewers. So yeah, maybe you reduce nitrogen in an innovative on-site, but now we're going to tell you you got a sewer. So the concern is we don't want our residents not to know what the issues are, and secondly, to have to do this twice. We want to try to help them only have to do this twice. But we all know how difficult it is to begin to project what someone else will do, like a regulator, or what might happen in 20 years. So those are the challenges we have. We are going to comment by January 30th on this. We encourage every resident to weigh in on it. Most of what I hear our residents saying, though, is, how am I going to pay for this?
Right.
The second question most frequent to me is, can't we just use our CWMP to be our nitrogen management plan? Obviously, that resident is really kind of read into this, because
Right.
that's a pretty technical question. So we're trying to respond, but I can't say conclusively either, quite honestly, because innovative on-sites, I don't know what it's going to cost you. It all depends on your home and where it's located and how far is it from resources or groundwater and, et cetera. So that's not necessarily a question that we can answer. And then CWMP, we do have an approved one. We are implementing it. We are going to be talking before Town Council, as I said earlier, about funding portions of it. And unless we proceed with it, then I don't know that it can be used as a valid plan to be approved as our nitrogen management plan. So
Again, great information. If there's one thing that you want a resident to do after watching that, what is it?
Please, if you have the time, follow this, comment on it, even if you just send an email, not just, but send an email to me, but there's lots of opportunities. And just saying, yes, I want this, or no, I don't want this, isn't enough. That isn't the question.
That's a statement, not a comment.
You need to say,
Right.
you need to try to understand enough, or ask us and we'll share our view. But that's what it is. It'd be wonderful if our residents have their view. A lot of them do. But share that concern about this in detail, because that's really what they're looking at. My concern is that we're kind of talking two different outcomes here. The regulators are talking about reducing nitrogen. We're talking about implementing our CWMP and meeting the TMDLs in those bays. Those are two very different processes, I think. And we seem to have that discussion a lot with people. So
All right. Well, there's lots more to talk about, but we'll get you for another town manager
always
update.
available. Thank you for
As
having
we have
me.
some new information. And again, January 30th is the final date to make your public comment to the Department of Environmental Protection. So thank you again, Town Manager.
Unless they extend it again.
Unless they extend it
That
again,
might be
right?
one of your comments.
Right?
Not enough time. Give us, they'll probably be looking at this in 30-day increments. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Excellent.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.